In a recent episode of How to Win an Election podcast by The Times, former Treasury advisor Simon Finkelstein attacks Zach Polanski on his economic policies. Let's take a look.
The Treasury wouldn't take long to give them messages like they gave to Kwasi Kwarteng in the aftermath of the mini budget.
If Prime Minister Zach Polanski has all these promises, how do just people? I'm interested to know the people you work with. How do they think about this? How do they go? We're going to have to make these impossible numbers add up. We're going to have to square these impossible circles.
Well, my optimistic take is that fiscal reality always asserts itself, and the bond market and the markets more generally exist. And if there was Prime Minister Zach Polanski and his Chancellor entering number 11, I think they would be hit with a fairly rude awakening, and the Treasury wouldn't take long to give them messages like they gave to Kwasi Kwarteng in the aftermath of the mini budget. The interesting thing, I think, they're spoken of as new and shiny. I think it's actually quite a boring programme from the Green Party. It's fairly old Corbynism, massive spending, huge tax rises, nationalisation. It's actually quite, and also funded by someone else. They haven't really set out an interesting way in which we shift the burden from assets to work or anything innovative. Really, what we're saying is the rich will pay with a nebulous wealth tax. And actually, none of the structural changes really that the economy might need actually are being addressed by him at all. And I think under the weight of those contradictions, rather than individual policies, the Green Party platform might fall.
These sorts of people need to be challenged. I'm really tired of the term old Corbynism, because we see right through that BS. It's the fact that they want to keep the rich rich and the poor poor. So people need to wake up when it comes to people like that trying to tell us about fiscal rules and fiscal responsibility, when all they want to do is line their own pockets. That's the scariness of it all. And I think the framing of that question was rooted in it was pushing him into a certain direction anyway. So that answer was going to be skewed anyway. But the classic big brain adults in the room with their quote unquote fiscal prudeness, claiming that spending lots of money is inherently bad. Finkelstein comes in with a notable fallacy when he invokes the bond markets. And there's two ways you can look at this. Number one, modern monetary theory, MMT, proponents say that you don't need the bond markets to fund anything. The government has a sovereign currency and it can spend money by creating it. There is no finite pile of money. This is true. We cannot run out of money. The constraints are real resources and inflation. You can't spend endlessly, but the limit isn't the amount of money the government has. It can add a zero electronically. It must be careful of how much it spends, otherwise prices will go up. Therefore, it doesn't rely on the bond market to fund things. It's pretty much immaterial. However, even if you are not supportive of MMT and you think governments must always borrow money to fund expenditure, it doesn't mean it has to be fiscally prudent, and certainly does not need austerity. Investors want certainty. That matters more than government policy. Raising taxes and spending a lot of money doesn't automatically spook the bond markets. As long as you communicate your long-term plan, explain how they will get their money back, everything will be fine. The Liz Truss situation is entirely different. She decided to bring in tax cuts for the wealthy on a random Saturday with no long-term plan. The policy itself wasn't the issue. The problem was lack of communication and strategy. Why does she cut taxes? Did she have a long-term plan? She could communicate to investors that cutting would boost growth? No, absolutely not. You want to spend more, as long as you have a long-term strategy, which is spend for investment. This will boost growth, increase jobs, etc., and the markets won't be spooked. But it's more neoliberal bollocks from the corporate media. Bansecker. We hear these arguments against the left a lot, that we're economically illiterate, yet the attacks itself are illiterate, but also dangerous. That way of thinking enabled 330,000 deaths from austerity. What are your thoughts? And do you think Zach can convince people to not listen to the so-called adults in the room?
Yeah, I thought it was so funny that he talks about, this is old Corbynism, it's actually quite boring. And then he listed off a load of stuff that sounded really exciting. That all sounds quite great. Because, we may have heard, a few people, on the left make these arguments over the years, but in terms of what we've actually been experiencing economically for the past 14 years at least. It's none of that stuff. So frankly, it all sounds very new and exciting, to be quite honest. If you're like me and you've lived your entire adult life under austerity and sort of neoliberal-esque political policies, then that all sounds very grand and exciting. Completely agree with the stuff that you said about the fact that I think bond markets they care more about than what he said, right? But bond markets care about credibility, yes, and that can be construed in lots of different ways. They care about predictability, so anything that comes up as a surprise, we're doing this, is likely to spook them a little bit in a way that a more well thought out plan in advance is less likely to. They care about growth prospects, so if you can talk about borrowing money to invest, for example, and how that money might then be returned back to the taxman, that should have an impact on how markets react. So you're completely right to talk about Liz Truss and her unfunded tax cuts, which came out of fucking nowhere, which really spooked the markets and gave them a real jump scare. So it's about a lot more than just literally, oh, I don't like that policy because it's left wing coded. It's something a bit more substantial than that. There is a real point to make, to be fair, and this is a challenge, I think, for Zach Polanski or anybody on the left who ever attains any kind of real hard political power. It would have been an issue for Jeremy Corbyn as well, something to think about if he had won in the elections he'd run in as well. There is a point about how bond markets can constrain our politics. And, rather than, I suppose, sort of chortling away on a podcast about, oh, well, that's just the way it is and people need to be realistic, that we could have a more detailed conversation about how we look at these difficulties with regards to bond markets and how bond markets can, I don't want to say hold us to ransom because that sounds too strong perhaps, but how bond markets can perhaps get in the way of things that we democratically have voted for. If the people of this country vote for the Green Party, let's say one day, and they end up being our governing party, they should be able to deliver on the things that they've promised, and a bunch of unelected people in the bond market shouldn't really be getting in the way of that. So we can have a conversation about what levers government might have, for example, to be able to release some of those constraints that the bond market sometimes put on economic ideas as well, right? A central bank, for example, can do things like cap yields and stabilize markets. If you look at countries like Japan as well, for example, they show that if government debt is held more by domestic institutions, central banks or other public bodies rather than private hands, which is what the bond market essentially is, that's again dispersing or having a wider portfolio of where bonds are issued, which means that perhaps we're less reliant on private bond markets who can then kind of hold us to ransom a little bit as well. I'm not an expert on these things by any means, but it would be nice if we had a media, I suppose, that was more interested in having those conversations about, well, how do we circumvent some of that, or how do we not be too reliant or too constrained on the bond markets if possible? Can we? It's a real question. It's a real question for socialists, communists, people who wish to see an economy that is beyond capitalism, perhaps as well. It's also a serious question for social democrats who wish to work within the constraints of capitalism. Can we do the things that we want to do within a capitalist system? So these are all important questions, and if we had a better media, we'd have that debate and conversation rather than two people just sneering over each other at a microphone about, oh, this lefty person wants a bit of money for poor people, but that's impossible because the bond markets won't like it. Let's have a real conversation, please. Some quality media would be nice. Do I think final point, do I think more people are listening? I think people seem to be quite excited by the Green Party. I don't wish to get carried away here. I do sometimes wonder if am I in an insane bubble where I just think this is better than it is, but like the Green Party winning a by-election council seat in Kent, I live in Kent just about, like, that's very impressive. The win that they pulled in Gorton and Denton as well, very impressive. So I think people are finding the optimism perhaps and the hope that is coming from the Green Party. It's not, reform's a bit dour now. They're a bit like, we lost, but that was actually rigged. And the Greens are offering, I think, a bit of hope and stuff. And there's been a real focus on cost of living, which of course is on everybody's minds. Probably is going to get worse if the situation in Iran is not resolved anytime soon as well. And so, I think that people are listening. And I think, most people, of course, are not thinking about the bond market when they hit the voting booth either. even I'm not, like, they're thinking about, do these policies sound good or not, and that's how I'll vote. So I don't think that this type of stuff, this doom mongering and scaremongering, didn't exactly work in the Brexit vote. People still voted against their economic interests, to be fair, then, and I don't think it's going to work probably now. So I think that the Greens still have a good chance, or whoever, people on the left, whoever, to put forward these types of ideas, hopefully without too much of a blocker, if it's packaged in the right way, and it's hopeful, and it's about something people can really latch onto and make sense of in their real life.